Ever tried explaining something super intricate to like a really sharp person and it just doesn't click? Like you hit a wall.
Yeah.
Someone who normally picks things up instantly. It's a weird feeling, right?
Yeah.
You'd think explaining things to a brilliant mind would be easy.
Mm.
But today, we're diving into why that isn't always the case.
Yeah.
It sometimes takes a really specific approach.
Right.
And we're not talking about like watering things down.
Yeah.
We're going deeper to see how even the most amazing minds work.
Yeah.
Especially when they're feeling a bit lacking something.
Exactly. We often think of intelligence as this unlimited thing, right?
Yeah.
This engine that just gets everything. But what happens when that engine runs low on fuel? Our mental bandwidth. That's what we're looking at in this deep dive.
Okay.
We're using this awesome book, Scarcity, by Senthil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir.
Okay.
And our goal is to see how this mindset of scarcity shapes even the brightest minds.
Okay.
Whether it's a lack of time, money, or even just focus, it impacts how they take in information and make choices. We're talking about understanding how even genius-level comprehension can be affected.
So to everyone listening, you're obviously curious and you love to learn complex stuff.
Right.
Think of this as peeking behind the scenes of your own thinking process.
Mm-hmm.
We're not saying you're not smart at all.
No.
We're just exploring those little things
Yeah.
that affect how information is processed and how well it sticks,
Exactly.
no matter how intelligent we are. Okay, let's get started.
Sure.
The first big idea is this scarcity mindset and how it leads to something called tunneling.
Right.
What's the basic principle behind that?
So basically, the scarcity mindset pops up when we feel like we're short on something important.
Okay.
Could be money, time, or even just mental focus.
Okay.
The book does a great job explaining that this feeling has a strong effect.
Okay.
It grabs our attention almost like a magnet.
Yeah.
This leads to tunneling.
Okay.
When we're in this tunnel, our focus narrows in on whatever is scarce right now.
Mm.
And we tend to ignore other things, even if those things might be important later on. It's not a choice, really. It's more like our mental vision gets narrower without us realizing it.
Like those hungry guys in the Minnesota study, right?
Right, exactly.
They were so fixated on food, it was like nothing else mattered.
Right. Even though they were physically hungry, their minds were completely absorbed by thoughts of food.
Yeah.
Planning meals, checking prices, even reading cookbooks.
Yeah.
One guy said food became the only thing he thought about.
Wow.
It wasn't that they chose to ignore a movie or anything. They
Yeah.
just couldn't help but notice every time someone ate.
That's wild.
This shows how scarcity can take over our thoughts and attention. It goes beyond just practical stuff and turns into a real fixation.
Yeah.
And the key takeaway here is this capture of attention. It happens almost automatically.
So even a super smart person, someone we'd call a genius, could get stuck in that tunnel.
Absolutely.
If their mental energy is laser focused on one part of a problem, they might miss the bigger picture,
Yes.
the wider context, or the long-term effects.
Yeah,
It's not about how smart they are. It's about what they're focusing on.
exactly. While that intense focus is helpful for the immediate issue, it can also make them blind to other important information.
Right.
It's not that their intelligence is preventing them from seeing the whole thing.
Right.
It's that their attention is pulled so strongly to one specific part of it.
Hmm.
It's like trying to see a huge landscape through a tiny peephole.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned bandwidth earlier. How does this feeling of scarcity actually affect our mental bandwidth?
Well, think of bandwidth as your overall mental capacity.
Okay.
Your ability to concentrate, make good decisions, stick to plans, and resist doing things impulsively. The book makes a strong case that scarcity in any form puts a bandwidth tax on us.
A bandwidth tax. So it's like this hidden drain on our mental resources.
Exactly, because our minds keep going back to whatever is scarce.
Okay.
We have less mental power for everything else that needs our attention.
Almost like having apps running in the background on your phone that slows everything down.
Yes, that's a great analogy. Imagine trying to really concentrate on a complex problem in a quiet office,
Okay.
but your thoughts keep drifting back to money worries. Those worries create these internal distractions that constantly interrupt your focus.
Yeah.
Like a distracting noise. Even though your surroundings are perfect for concentration, your mind is preoccupied.
Right.
That's the bandwidth tax in action.
Okay.
Those internal disruptions are caused by the feeling of scarcity. They keep pulling our attention away from what we're trying to do.
And this isn't just some feeling, right?
No.
There's actual scientific proof that our cognitive capacity gets reduced.
Absolutely. The researchers used the Raven's progressive matrices test.
Okay.
It's a well-known way to measure fluid intelligence, which is your ability to think logically and solve new problems even without any specific knowledge.
Okay.
Studies with farmers in India showed something really interesting. They found that these farmers did much worse on these cognitive tests before their harvest, when they were struggling financially.
Okay.
But they did much better after the harvest when they had money.
Okay.
The key thing is their nutrition didn't change much between those times.
So it wasn't about what they were eating. It was about their finances.
Yes.
Okay.
This strongly suggests that the feeling of not having enough money was directly affecting their thinking abilities.
Wow.
Not just because they were lacking food or something.
So even if you're super intelligent, if your mental energy is being used up by worries or other things, even if those things have nothing to do with what you're trying to understand, your ability to fully grasp explanations is going to be lower.
Right. It's like trying to fill a glass, but there's a leak somewhere else in the system. Exactly. It's like using a powerful computer, but with limited processing power.
Okay.
No matter how advanced the software is, which in this case is your intelligence,
Yeah.
the limited resources will hold it back.
Okay, so scarcity leads to this narrowed focus and less mental bandwidth.
Right.
How do these things together affect our ability to see the bigger picture? You mentioned neglect earlier.
Yes. So when we tunnel, our focus becomes so intense that we almost always neglect things outside that narrow view. Even if those things are really important for understanding or making decisions in the long run, they just don't stand out as much when our minds are locked onto the immediate scarcity.
So we miss the forest for the trees.
Exactly.
Can you give me a real-world example of this tunneling and neglect?
Sure, think about firefighters rushing to a fire.
Okay.
They're so focused on getting there fast and putting out the flames that they might miss some important safety checks. Or forget to think about the overall strategy.
Yeah.
The book calls this a focus dividend for getting things done quickly, but it can also lead to neglect.
Right.
Their attention is so intensely on the crisis right in front of them that other things, even if they're important, get pushed aside.
So how does this connect to explaining something to someone really smart?
Well, if they don't immediately see how your explanation helps them with their main focus or what's urgent to them, they might mentally tunnel right past details that seem less important at first.
Exactly.
They might be so caught up in a specific part of the problem or a particular question that they accidentally filter out basic information or context.
Okay.
While those details might not grab their attention right away,
Right.
they could be crucial for really understanding the whole thing.
It's not that they can't understand those details. It's that their attention is somewhere else.
Yeah.
And those details are outside their current mental tunnel.
Exactly.
This is fascinating. Now, the book also talks about slack and trade-off thinking. How do those ideas relate to what we've been talking about?
Slack means the buffer or wiggle room we have with our resources,
Okay.
whether it's time, money, or even our mental capacity.
Okay.
When we're not feeling the pressure of scarcity.
Right.
Abundance usually gives us more slack,
Okay.
but scarcity forces us to think about trade-offs. When resources are tight, we're always weighing what we have to give up to get something else.
Right.
Every decision becomes a calculation, like what's the opportunity cost?
Yeah.
Often down to the smallest detail.
The book mentions a survey of commuters.
Right.
And how people with lower incomes were way more likely to think about trade-offs when deciding whether to buy a TV. What makes that so insightful here?
That survey shows how scarcity puts trade-offs right at the front of our minds. Those commuters with less money were always thinking, if I buy this TV, what else will I have to give up?
Right.
Things I need or other chances I'll miss.
Yeah.
This kind of careful trade-off thinking wasn't as common among people with more money.
Okay.
People who had more financial slack.
So how might this affect someone really intelligent when they're trying to learn something new?
Someone who's used to picking things up quickly.
Right.
Maybe because they've always had plenty of mental resources for learning might not be as good at this detailed trade-off thinking.
Exactly.
Which is sometimes really important for understanding things deeply.
Right.
Especially when it's a totally new or complicated subject.
They might be used to absorbing information easily.
Right.
Without having to consciously think about every detail and what it means compared to other ideas.
Mm.
But when they face something really new or complex, that lack of trade-off thinking can actually hold them back.
Okay.
That constant assessment of what they might be missing by focusing on one thing,
Right.
they might skim over basic stuff,
Yeah.
assuming they'll get it later,
Right.
without realizing they're making a trade-off in terms of how well they'll understand it in the long run. It's almost like a paradox. You'd think a brilliant mind would be better at thinking about trade-offs.
Not necessarily when they're outside their comfort zone or when their mental energy is already being used up elsewhere.
Okay.
Scarcity makes us super aware of trade-offs.
Right.
Because messing up with limited resources has bigger consequences.
Yeah.
Without that pressure, even a really smart person might not automatically do that kind of cost-benefit analysis when learning new things.
Mm.
They might not naturally ask themselves, by focusing on this, am I missing other important ideas?
The book also mentions how being an expert in something can kind of protect us from the negative effects of scarcity.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Expertise in a specific area gives us a much deeper understanding of the basic elements and how things are measured in that field. Like professional musicians can judge time intervals way more accurately than people without musical training.
Yeah.
Musicians have this internal clock developed from years of practice.
Right.
They don't have to rely as much on their perception or external cues. Okay.
This deeper understanding and these internal benchmarks can help counteract some of the mental biases and limits that scarcity can create.
So if you're explaining something within their area of expertise,
Yeah.
a really smart person might be less affected by tunneling or a taxed bandwidth
Right.
because they have that strong foundation to rely on.
Exactly. Their existing knowledge acts like a kind of cognitive slack in that specific area. They can process information more efficiently,
Okay.
spot patterns more easily, and understand why even small details are important.
Okay.
Because they have this well-established mental framework. But, and this is important, if you're explaining something outside their main area of expertise,
Right.
even the most brilliant mind can still be vulnerable to the cognitive biases and limits caused by scarcity.
Okay.
Especially if they're already mentally stretched or if the information triggers unproductive tunneling.
Right.
Say generally intelligent is awesome.
But it doesn't automatically mean you're an expert in every single area.
That makes sense. Now let's talk about how scarcity can make us act more short-sightedly.
Okay.
The book discusses borrowing and myopia.
Right. Scarcity can make us really want to deal with immediate needs, even if it means borrowing from the future, which often has bad consequences later on.
Right.
The story of Sandra and her payday loans is a good example. She needed money right away, so she took out a loan with crazy high interest rates,
Yeah.
which ended up trapping her in a cycle of debt.
Right.
Focusing on what she needed right now made her blind to the financial burden it would create later.
How does this tendency to borrow from the future relate to how even a brilliant person might process information when they're under pressure or feeling overwhelmed?
When there's time pressure, too much information, or a really intense focus on one immediate problem,
Yeah.
even the smartest person might use mental shortcuts or make assumptions that lead to misunderstandings or bad decisions later on. It's like mentally borrowing understanding from the future
Right.
without actually building the necessary foundation of knowledge in the present.
Okay.
They might get the surface level of an explanation, but miss key underlying principles that become crucial later. It's like they're building up a cognitive debt.
So they might prioritize getting a quick answer or understanding one specific point right now,
Yes.
even if it means skipping over more fundamental concepts that would lead to a much better and longer-lasting understanding in the long run.
Exactly. The pressure of the moment or the appeal of a quick fix can overshadow the importance of building a solid and thorough understanding.
Okay.
They might be smart enough to understand the nuances,
Right.
but the scarcity mindset, in this case, a scarcity of time or attention,
Yeah.
pushes them toward getting an answer quickly, even if it means they might not understand it as well in the long term.
The book also emphasizes neglecting the future as another big consequence of focusing too much on the scarcity we're dealing with right now.
Right. When we use most of our mental energy on dealing with scarcity right now, we don't have much left to think about what might happen later. Like that example of someone rushing to finish a report and forgetting to include references because of a deadline,
Yeah.
only for that mistake to come back and bite them later.
Right.
The pressure of the deadline made them forget about the consequences of not doing the work properly.
So when explaining something to a really smart person, if what you're saying doesn't immediately click with their current goals or understanding, they might not put in the effort to fully grasp the long-term implications or how it connects to their future learning or projects.
Exactly. They naturally focus on what seems relevant to them right now if they don't see that immediate connection.
Right.
The future benefits or the importance of understanding all the details might not even enter their current tunnel of attention.
Okay.
They might intellectually acknowledge the information,
Right.
but it won't have the same impact or really become part of their existing knowledge.
This shows how scarcity can create these vicious cycles, these scarcity traps.
Right.
How do those develop, and how could they affect a bright person's learning?
Scarcity traps happen because the things we do when we feel scarce can actually make it harder to escape that scarcity. Like that example of the street vendor who doesn't save a little bit of money each day and stays in debt.
Yeah.
Needing those few rupees right now stops them from doing something that would help them financially in the long run.
So if there's a misunderstanding or a gap in basic knowledge early on in an explanation, maybe because of the effects of scarcity we've been talking about, it could create a trap where later information is misunderstood, not fully absorbed.
Exactly.
Making it really hard to understand the whole thing.
That initial lack of understanding, maybe because of a taxed bandwidth or unhelpful tunneling, can be like a small but significant crack in a foundation.
Okay.
As more complex ideas are built on top of it, those cracks can get bigger, leading to a whole bunch of misunderstandings. The smart person might still get individual concepts, but their overall understanding will be weaker because of that initial scarcity trap in their learning.
Okay, so based on all these interesting principles, what are some key things we should remember when trying to explain complicated ideas effectively, especially to someone super intelligent?
Considering how much scarcity can affect even the most capable minds, there are several important strategies.
Okay.
First, try to be really aware of and minimize any bandwidth tax the listener might be experiencing. Make your explanations super clear and logical to reduce unnecessary mental effort.
Okay.
Break down complicated ideas into smaller, easier to understand parts.
So having a clear structure and logical flow is even more important when you think someone's mental resources might be stretched.
Absolutely.
Even if they're really smart.
A well-organized explanation makes it much easier to process the information. Second, address their potential tunnel of focus. Present the information in a way that grabs their attention right away and clearly connects to their current interests, goals, or burning questions.
Okay.
Make sure they see why it's relevant to them from the very beginning.
Basically, you need to quickly show why this information matters to them in their current situation.
Exactly. Third, give them slack.
Okay.
Allow plenty of time and opportunities for them to think and ask questions.
Okay.
Don't overwhelm them with too much information too fast.
Right.
Give them the mental space they need to process and absorb the new knowledge properly.
So even if they seem to be understanding things quickly, it's still important not to rush the explanation.
Right.
And to give them pauses and chances to digest the information.
Exactly. Fourth, highlight the long-term relevance and implications of the information.
Okay.
Connect it to how they might use it in the future, broader understanding in their field, or even their personal interests. This encourages them to invest their mental energy beyond just the immediate details. Show them the bigger picture they might miss if they only focus on the initial points.
Make sure they see the lasting value in understanding the core principles.
Yeah.
Not just the immediate surface level application.
Correct. Fifth, if the topic requires careful consideration of different options, perspectives, or approaches, guide them through the trade-offs in a clear and organized way.
Okay.
Help them see the potential costs and benefits of each choice.
Basically help them do that trade-off thinking that might not come naturally.
Exactly.
If they're used to learning things effortlessly.
Sixth, if the smart person doesn't have specific background knowledge in the area you're explaining, build that foundation step by step.
Okay.
Make sure they understand the core concepts before moving on to more complex ideas.
Right.
Don't assume they already know things in areas where they might not be experts.
So even if they're super intelligent, generally Domain-specific knowledge still needs to be built gradually.
Absolutely. And finally, use concrete examples and relatable analogies to make abstract concepts more real and easier to grasp,
Right.
especially when their mental bandwidth might be low because of other things.
Right.
Remember that story about the dirt candy restaurant and how focusing your attention can make something ordinary seem amazing?
Yeah.
Use similar relatable examples to illustrate your points and make them understand better.
So it comes down to being very aware of their cognitive state,
Yeah.
organizing the information clearly, and making sure they see both the immediate and long-term value.
Exactly.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive into the psychology of explaining complex ideas effectively, especially to those brilliant minds.
To sum up, even the most amazing intellects are affected by the basic psychological effects of scarcity, especially how it impacts our attention, mental bandwidth, and decision-making.
Right.
Explaining things to a genius isn't about making it super simple.
Right.
It's about understanding how their minds work to help them process information better and understand things more deeply.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How often has we all, no matter how smart we are, experienced our own kinds of scarcity?
Right.
Whether it's not enough time, attention, or mental focus.
Yeah.
And how has that affected our ability to learn and truly understand things? Maybe you, the listener, could take a moment to think about times when you felt mentally overwhelmed even though you knew you were capable.
Yeah.
And consider if maybe your mental bandwidth was taxed or your attention was too narrow.
We hope this exploration gives you a new perspective.
Yeah.
Not just on how to communicate complex ideas to others,
Right.
but also on how we learn and process information when our minds are under pressure. There's always more to learn about how our minds work.
Yeah.
And understanding these principles of scarcity gives us a great framework for that ongoing journey of intellectual exploration.
Absolutely.